It's 5:12 in the morning on April 18th, 1906, and San Francisco is just beginning to stir. The fog rolls in off the bay the way it always does, slow, grey, salt-heavy, settling over the cobblestones of Market Street like a blanket. A fishmonger at the Ferry Building loads his first crates of the day. A cable car operator climbs into his cab on Powell Street, fastens his gloves, and checks the time. In Chinatown, the smell of charcoal and frying oil drifts from kitchens not yet open. On Nob Hill, the Grand Hotel stands silent, their guests sleeping off last night's performances at the Grand Opera House, where the world-famous tenor Enrico Caruso had sung to a packed house just hours before. Across the bay, the hills catch the first pale suggestion of dawn. This is San Francisco at its most ordinary. A city of 400,000 people. One of the wealthiest, most sophisticated cities in America. Unremarkable. Forgettable. By 8 o'clock this morning, the largest city on the American West Coast will be on fire. The man in that cable car will be dead. The hotels on Nob Hill will be cinders. And 3,000 people in this city, at minimum, will be dead. In 3 days, 490 city blocks will be ash. San Francisco, as it exists this morning, will cease to exist. It began at 5:12 a.m. and it lasted 45 seconds. To understand what happened here, you first need to understand where San Francisco sat, and why that geography made it a death trap waiting to be sprung. Picture a narrow peninsula thrust into the Pacific, surrounded by water on three sides. San Francisco Bay to the east, the Golden Gate to the north, the cold, open Pacific to the west. The city had nowhere to spread except back toward the hills. And the hills were steep, beautiful, and treacherous. Now imagine the ground beneath those neighbourhoods closest to the bay. Much of it wasn't ground at all. For decades, the city had been expanding outward into the bay itself, dumping fill, debris, sand, and rubble into the water to create new land for new buildings. The financial district, the waterfront, the south of Market neighbourhood. All of it built on what engineers call make land, soft, waterlogged fill that sits atop nothing more solid than mud and ancient bay sediment. When the earth shakes, solid bedrock vibrates. But soft fill does something different. It liquefies. The soil particles lose their cohesion. The ground behaves like a liquid, and anything built on top of it doesn't just shake, it sinks. In some neighbourhoods, the shaking was amplified 3 times over simply because of what was beneath the streets. San Francisco had built an entire civilization on ground designed to fail. And there was one more thing working against the city that morning. Something that would turn a catastrophic earthquake into a 3-day apocalypse. The water mains. The pipes that fed the city's fire hydrants were old, brittle, and ran in parallel lines across the same unstable ground. One good shake, engineers had warned for years, and those pipes would snap like dry twigs. They were right. Beneath California, invisible and indifferent, runs one of the most dangerous geological features on Earth, the San Andreas Fault, 800 miles long, slicing through the state like a seam on a baseball. From the Salton Sea in the south to Cape Mendocino in the north. For millions of years, 2 of the Earth's great tectonic plates have been grinding against each other along this line, the Pacific Plate moving northwest, the North American Plate holding its ground. The pressure between them builds for decades, then it releases. On April 18th, 1906, 296 miles of that fault ruptured simultaneously. The energy released in those 45 seconds was equivalent to over 600 Hiroshima atomic bombs. The rupture travelled north and south at 2 miles per second. The ground on one side of the fault shifted as much as 20 feet relative to the ground on the other. In an instant, fences that crossed the fault line were torn in half. Roads were offset. A cow, according to one survivor account, was swallowed by the earth up to her neck. The force arrived at San Francisco's mainland neighbourhoods and was amplified, tripled in some locations, by the soft fill beneath them. But here is what made the 1906 earthquake uniquely catastrophic. The earthquake itself did not kill San Francisco. Not directly. What would kill San Francisco was fire, and the city had been warned, explicitly and in writing, that it was not prepared. In 1905, 1 year before the earthquake, the National Board of Fire Underwriters sent investigators to San Francisco. They produced a formal report. The language was blunt. San Francisco has violated all underwriting traditions and precedents by not burning up. In our opinion, it is only a matter of time before she burns. 1 year. They had exactly 1 year. The man most responsible for San Francisco's water supply on the morning of April 18th, 1906, was not a city official. He was a private monopolist. The Spring Valley Water Company controlled every drop of water that flowed through San Francisco's pipes. For decades, they had operated the city's aging water infrastructure for profit, patching where they should have replaced, deferring what should have been done immediately. The pipe network serving the fire hydrants ran through the most geologically unstable neighbourhoods in the city. Engineers inside and outside the company knew it. They said so in writing. San Francisco's fire chief, a man named Dennis Sullivan, had been begging the Board of Supervisors for years to build a separate, redundant auxiliary water system, a network of cisterns, independent of the mains, that could supply firefighters even if the pipes failed. He filed reports, he submitted budgets, he presented the math. The Board of Supervisors declined. The money was needed elsewhere. The Spring Valley Water Company lobbied against competition, and Mayor Eugene Schmitz, already under federal indictment for extortion and bribery, had neither the integrity nor the interest to force the issue. They were warned. They ignored it. They were warned again. They did nothing. There is a specific, named decision that sealed San Francisco's fate. In 1900, city engineers proposed a hilltop reservoir that would have provided an independent water source for the fire department. The proposal was rejected on cost grounds. The estimated savings, $200,000. The cost of that decision, 6 years later, $400 million in property losses, tens of thousands of homes, 3,000 lives. There is one more detail worth sitting with. In 1905, the same year the fire underwriters issued their warning, the city's own engineering department noted that the Maidland pipe network was at high risk of failure in a major seismic event. That report was filed. That report was ignored. Every spring, when the rain stopped and the dry season began, the city's fire chiefs held their breath. Every year, the pipes held. Until the morning they didn't. April 17th, 1906 had been a warm evening in San Francisco. The opera was sold out. Enrico Caruso, the greatest tenor in the world, had performed the role of Don Jose in Carmen at the Grand Opera House on Mission Street. The audience gave him a standing ovation. He returned to his suite at the Palace Hotel, the grandest hotel in the American West, 7 stories of steel and marble, and fell asleep near midnight. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, there was a sound, not shaking, not yet. A sound to describe by survivors as a deep, approaching roar, like a freight train coming through the floor of the earth. It lasted 2 seconds, then the ground moved. The first jolt was violent enough to throw people from their beds. Pictures flew off walls. Chimneys, thousands of them. The same chimneys that vented the gas stoves, and fireplaces of every home in the city, cracked, collapsed, and tumbled through roofs. Those chimneys were the first killers, not the earth itself. The masonry raining down from above. The shaking lasted 45 seconds. In the Maidland neighbourhood south of Market Street, the ground rippled in visible waves. Witnesses described seeing the street move like the surface of a lake in a storm. Buildings that had stood for decades buckled and pancaked. The Windsor Hotel on 5th Street compressed from 6 stories to 2. The Leland Hotel on 3rd Street folded entirely. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan was in his quarters at Engine Company No. 3 on Bush Street when the chimneys from the adjacent California Hotel collapsed through his ceiling. He was pulled from the rubble, alive but with catastrophic head and chest injuries. He would die 4 days later, never regaining consciousness, never knowing what happened to the city he had spent years trying to protect. Within 8 minutes of the first jolt, there were 50 separate fires burning across the city. The people of San Francisco had no idea what that number meant yet, but the city's firefighters did. They turned their hoses on the hydrants. Nothing came out. The pipes had ruptured across more than 30,000 breakpoints throughout the city. Every main that crossed the Maidland neighbourhoods had snapped. San Francisco's firefighters stood in the streets with limp hoses, watching the fires spread, and understood immediately that they were going to lose. The south of Market District went first. This was the city's working-class heart. Dense blocks of wooden rooming houses, hotels and industrial buildings packed so tightly together that fire could leap from roof to roof without ever touching the street. The earthquake had already done its worst work here. The soft fill had moved. Buildings had collapsed mid-block, trapping hundreds of residents in the rubble, while fire climbed the walls above them. On Valencia Street, a 4-story wood-frame hotel did something survivors would describe for the rest of their lives. It sank. Not collapsed. Sank. The soft ground beneath it liquefied in seconds, and the Valencia Street Hotel dropped 2 full stories straight into the earth. The upper floors remained nearly intact, tilted at a sickening angle, guests on those floors crawling out through windows onto rubble. The guests on the lower floors were buried alive, some drowned in the groundwater that flooded in behind them. When rescuers arrived, they could hear people calling from beneath the street. An estimated 200 people died on that single block. In Chinatown, brick buildings, many constructed on the same unstable fill, fell into the streets in sections. Grant Avenue was impassable within minutes, blocked by walls of rubble 3 stories tall. Residents who survived the collapse ran toward the waterfront, carrying what they could, speaking in a half-dozen languages. On Nob Hill, the masonry palaces of the railroad barons cracked and shuddered, but mostly held. The guests at the Palace Hotel, including Caruso, were awake now. Caruso stood at his window and looked south. The sky was already orange. He dressed quickly, gathered his photographs in one small case, and walked out of the Palace Hotel into a city that was disappearing in real time. At 5:30 a.m., just 18 minutes after the earthquake, a woman in the Hayes Valley neighborhood of San Francisco did something utterly ordinary. She lit her kitchen stove to cook breakfast. Her chimney, she didn't know, had cracked clean through in the earthquake. The smoke had nowhere to go. The fire caught the fractured flue, found the gap in the mortar, and spread sideways into the wall studs of her building. Within minutes, it was climbing through the attic and into the wooden building next door. Firefighters arrived within 10 minutes. Captain Charles Cullen ordered his crew to connect to the nearest hydrant on Fell Street. No water. They stood there, 6 trained firefighters with a fully equipped engine. They stood there and watched a kitchen fire become a block fire, become a neighbourhood fire. By 7 a.m, it had jumped Guff Street. By 9 a.m, it had consumed 4 blocks of wooden Victorian homes that the earthquake had barely touched. By 11 a.m, it had merged with the fires coming out of the south of Market, and the combined front was moving northeast toward the financial district. That fire, called the Ham and Eggs Fire from the day it started, burned for 6 hours on its own and killed hundreds. Its cause, a cracked chimney. Its location, a neighbourhood the earthquake had not destroyed. It was one of 52 fires burning simultaneously across the city that morning. By noon on April 18th, the fires had merged into a single moving wall of flame. But the nightmare wasn't over. It was about to get worse. General Frederick Funston, commander of the US Army's Pacific Division at the Presidio, had woken to the earthquake and immediately ordered 4,000 troops into the city. He did this without authorization from Washington, without approval from the mayor. He simply decided, and he had a plan. Dynamite. Demolish buildings ahead of the fire lines. Create gaps the flames couldn't cross. The theory was sound. The execution was catastrophic. Soldiers with no demolition training used too much explosive, placed it poorly, and repeatedly blew flaming debris across streets and onto rooftops that hadn't yet caught. Entire blocks that the fire had not yet reached were ignited by the Army's own fire breaks. On Sacramento Street, Army dynamite set fire to a row of mansions that had survived both the earthquake and the initial fire front. On Van Ness Avenue, a broad street intended as the city's last firebreak, soldiers blew buildings on the wrong side of the line and spread the fire they were trying to stop. For 3 days, April 18th, 19th and 20th, the fires burned. The wind shifted. The dynamite echoed through the hills. The financial district fell on the evening of the 18th, the western addition through the 19th, the mansions of Nob Hill on the morning of the 20th. The Palace Hotel, which had survived the earthquake without structural damage, burned on the afternoon of April 18th. It burned for 12 hours, the most fireproof building in the city. Gone. By the time it was over, 490 city blocks destroyed. 28,000 buildings reduced to ash and exposed chimneys, an area 4 miles wide and 2 miles deep, the beating heart of one of America's great cities, simply gone. The official death toll published by the city of San Francisco in the weeks after the earthquake was 478. That number was a lie, not an undercount, not a hasty estimate, a deliberate, documented suppression of the truth, orchestrated by city officials and real estate interests who understood that an accurate death toll would devastate property values and drive investors away. The city needed to be seen as resilient, not annihilated, and so they published 478. Modern historians and seismologists, working from death records, survivor accounts, hospital logs, and burial registers, placed the true figure at a minimum of 3,000 dead, and possibly as high as 6,000. The California Earthquake Investigation Commission would later acknowledge the discrepancy. The city's own coroner had noted at the time that the bodies were too numerous to process individually. The suppression wasn't subtle, it was policy. Among the confirmed dead, 396 children under the age of 10. Entire families, grandparents, parents, infants, buried together, never separated from their homes as those homes collapsed on them. At least 200 people on the Valencia Street Hotel block alone, and an unknown number, historians believe in the hundreds, who died in the fires before anyone could reach them, whose names appear on no list. 225,000 people were left homeless, out of a population of 400,000. They lived in army tents in Golden Gate Park, in makeshift camps in the Panhandle, in the vacant lots where their houses had been. The army distributed food. The Red Cross arrived with blankets and nurses. William Randolph Hearst ran supply trains from Los Angeles. Congress appropriated $9 million in federal aid, nearly $300 million in today's money. In Chinatown, the rebuilding was deliberately delayed. City officials saw the earthquake as an opportunity to relocate the Chinese community to the margins of the city. The Chinese residents organised, hired lawyers, and fought back. They won the right to return, but not before months of displacement, denial of property access, and targeted obstruction from the very city that was accepting aid money on their behalf. The last fires were extinguished on the morning of April the 23rd, 5 days after the earthquake. The city began the count. And the city began the lie. The evidence was not complicated. The National Board of Fire Underwriters had warned in writing, 1 year before the earthquake, that San Francisco would burn. The fire chief had requested an auxiliary water system and been denied repeatedly. The Spring Valley Water Company had maintained aging infrastructure in geologically unstable ground and collected their rates. City officials, presided over by a mayor under active federal indictment for corruption, had declined every opportunity to address any of it. 3,000 people were dead, 28,000 buildings were ash, 225,000 people were sleeping in tents in the park. Survivors filed claims. Legal proceedings were opened. The Spring Valley Water Company submitted testimony, explaining that pipe failures in earthquakes were unforeseeable acts of God. The courts accepted it. Mayor Schmitz, convicted of extortion after the earthquake, saw his conviction overturned on appeal and spent the remainder of his life in San Francisco politics, eventually winning election to the Board of Supervisors. Not a single official, company, or institution paid $1 in damages to the families of the dead. The death toll wasn't officially revised until 2005. For 99 years, San Francisco maintained in its formal, historical record that 478 people had died. The actual figure, a minimum of 3,000, possibly double, was a footnote in academic journals and the private knowledge of historians who couldn't get anyone to care. San Francisco rebuilt with extraordinary speed. By 1915, just 9 years after the earthquake, the city hosted the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a world's fair designed in part to announce to the world that San Francisco had not merely survived but triumphed. The fair drew 18 million visitors. The message was unmistakable. Don't look at the ash. Look at what we built in its place. Today, if you walk through the south of Market neighbourhood, Soma they call it now, you are walking on the same fill that liquefied in 1906. The same soft sediment, the same bay mud. The buildings are taller, the pipes are newer. The USGS estimates a 72% probability of of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake striking the Bay Area in the next 30 years. Seismologists call it the Big One. In 1906, the Big One came. It brought down a city in 45 seconds and then burned it for 3 days. It killed at least 3,000 people, possibly twice that. It left 225,000 people without homes. It destroyed 490 city blocks and $400 million in property. And the city's first official act was to erase the dead from the record. On the corner of 18th and Valencia Streets in San Francisco, if you know where to look, there is a subtle depression in the asphalt. The street sits slightly lower there than on either side. Beneath it, still in the ground, are the remnants of the Valencia Street Hotel, the building that sank, not fell. The building where 200 people went to sleep on the night of April 17th and never came back up. The San Andreas Fault is still there. The fill is still there. The warnings are still there. Remember San Francisco, not for the speed of its rebuilding, for the 3,000 people whose deaths were erased from the record for a century. Because the truth was less convenient than the real estate market,